First, welcome to all the new faces. We appreciate you coming. This is a new location for us. I'm Joanne Richards, and I'm the president of the Board of Common Ground for Texans. As many of you know, we usually meet at Yarborough Library. The Yarborough Library is closing for the year for renovation. And so everybody that met at Yarborough Library is now scattering all over the city in hopes that we found a place, and we did. So, you know, we're lucky. We're one of the lucky few, I guess. I think we were number 3 on the list. You know, as I got up at 6 o'clock in the morning to get here to put in our request for a room, we were fortunate. So, 2018 is off to a wonderful start. And as I say, I appreciate all of you being here. And it will be a wonderful start for all of us who are interested in controversial topics. The one that we're going to talk about today is religion and politics, endorsed by God. And so we have a distinguished panel, and we will begin by having Mike Ignikowski, who's our resident moderator, who does a wonderful job, begin the conversation, and he will introduce each of the panelists. And it's an interesting panel. So, enjoy. We do have coffee and cookies, as always, because we used to be Coffee Party Austin. We are no longer Coffee Party Austin, however, we still have coffee.
There's a seat open here.
There's a seat open here. There's a seat open here. There are a couple of seats back there. So that's what. So, Mike.
Thank you, Joanne. I used to joke that we called ourselves a part of the coffee party because the coffee party was the exact opposite of the tea party in every way you can think. But we're actually not a political party at all, so the name was confusing. So we changed to Common Ground for Texans. And as Joanne said, this has been an exciting first week in 2018. If anyone here was in line at midnight at a bookstore for any reason, I hope you caught up on your sleep, because this is going to be another exciting topic here. We're going to talk about the separation of church and state and religious freedom, and how religious groups deal with political issues and their social justice issues. The format we're going to use is fairly typical. I'm going to give a brief introduction to the background of the material. We're going to have our 4 distinguished panelists each take about 5 or 10 minutes each to give their views on the issue, and I'll introduce them as we get going. I have a follow-up question or two. If there's too much uniformity of the views, I may have to play devil's advocate here. And then we'll open it up to the audience for questions and comments after that. And then we'll try and leave enough time at the end for people to come up and talk with the individual panel members if they want. So, the Johnson Amendment is a law that was used to prevent, or at least discourage, religious organizations from engaging in partisan politics, and I'll explain a little bit more about that in a moment. But the reason we picked this topic was that last fall, as part of the tax bill, the House of Representatives included in their tax bill a repeal of the Johnson Amendment. Now, the Senate version did not have that repeal in there, and it got removed from the final resolution compromise. But we expect it to come back. President Trump has mentioned on a number of occasions that he is strongly in favor of repealing the Johnson Amendment, and the Republican Party platform calls for the repeal of the Johnson Amendment. So we expect it will be an issue for a while here. Let me explain a little bit about how this came about in history. In the early 1950s, there was a tax-exempt nonprofit group in Texas called Facts Forum that was spreading a lot of anti-communist conspiracy theories and philosophy on TV and radio in the guise of public service announcements and programs. And it was being used in the Democratic primary in Texas to campaign against a fairly centrist, moderate U.S. senator called Lyndon Baines Johnson. who was apparently not quite anti-communist enough. And he won the election anyway, re-elected to the Senate, and in 1954 he slipped into a tax bill a provision that barred nonprofit tax-exempt 501c3 organizations from endorsing political candidates, or at least if they did, they would lose their tax-exempt status. It was not meant to be an anti-religious issue at all. In fact, at the time, people gave very little thought to the idea that this would actually apply to religious organizations too. So let me explain what this actual Johnson Amendment means. And I've been personally involved in social action efforts at 2 different churches. So this is how it was explained to us. The law allows for churches and any nonprofit really to engage in what we call issue advocacy. We are free to basically speak our minds as much as we want on any issue in a non-partisan fashion. Churches can even organize voter registration drives and hand out fact sheets on candidates. What they cannot do is endorse political candidates or parties or campaign against political candidates or parties. Although actually they can, it's completely legal. They can even donate money to candidates' election campaigns, but if they do, they'll lose their tax-exempt status.
Theoretically.
Theoretically. It turns out that this has not been really enforced that much from the IRS. There's been, according to what I saw on the web, one church that lost its tax-exempt status when it ran a newspaper ad against Bill Clinton in the 1992 election. There's been no religious organization that has ever lost its tax-exempt status from anything that was said in the pulpit or in a service. A lot of religious organizations, the left and right, have kind of pushed the boundaries to see what they can get away with. There, in fact, is a group of mainly conservative churches that engages in Pulpit Freedom Sunday, where they deliberately try and walk up to and cross the line of what they are allowed to say, and then send a copy of their sermon to the IRS en masse. But so far the IRS has not bitten on that bait and done anything about it. But the threat is still there, and that has more or less kept a lot of the religious organizations from going too far overboard. So with that background, I'd like to open this up for our panelists to give their views on the Johnson Amendment. What is the role of churches in political life in America, and whatever else they feel like talking about for 5 or 10 minutes. And we'll start off here on my right with Reverend Mary Wilson. She's the pastor of the Church of the Savior since 2002. She received a BS in mathematics from Oklahoma Baptist University and a master's in mathematics from SUNY New Paltz in New York. After teaching math for 20 years, mostly at Austin Community College, she received a master's in theological studies from Austin Presbyterian Seminary and a master's divinity degree from Austin Presbyterian Theological Seminary. Now, some of you may think it's a little bit odd for someone with her background to be in the ministry now, but she assures us that it fits very well with the Austin high-tech community here. Mary.
Yeah. Can I go ahead and stand up?
Sure. It's a big room, so make sure.
It is. It's a big room, and my voice is not 100% today, so let me see if I can come to you and get my voice to reach you. I've been a math professor, and now I'm a minister. I am also running for a political office at the moment. And for the purposes of this conversation, we don't need to go into all the reasons why or what office, but you can find it if you need to. So when we were talking about this particular form, I said, I have lots of opinions about the Johnson Amendment from multiple perspectives. My perspective as a minister and my perspective as a political candidate now. So as a minister for the past 15 to 16 years, I've been an advocate for social justice issues. And so when I preach from the pulpit, I preach on behalf of equality for LGBTQ persons. That does not always sit well with some people's political leanings, as you might imagine. I am an advocate for our public school systems. I've lobbied in our state house with a group called Pastors for Texas Children. And so it's clearly a religious group lobbying on behalf of a public good. And I've also lobbied on behalf of the Texas Freedom Network, another, it's nonpartisan in many ways, but it clearly leans left. And we have advocated for instance, this past spring and summer in opposition of the bathroom bill. And I spoke to many representatives, testified 3 times in opposition to it, even had the opportunity to speak with Representative Hunter, who does the calendar for the House, and talk to him about the opposition I had towards this bill and the unfairness that I felt and the bias it had. So clearly, I believe in being politically involved. And back in the early 80s or so, when the moral majority was forming, I was not opposed to their existence. My critique was I just thought they were wrong about what they were proposing and what they were supporting. But I thought their rights as people, not just of faith, but as citizens of our country, to engage in our political process, because their faith perspectives pointed them to a particular direction, was not necessarily wrong in and of itself. I just didn't like their conclusions. And so my perspective would be to argue the opposite points, also from my particular faith perspective. So I think we come into this political realm as people of faith. We don't actually check our faith at the door. We just don't. And our faith informs the totality of the way we live our life. And it also then informs the way we vote, the way we advocate for what we think is right and moral and that sort of thing. So in one hand, we're not going to ever separate people out from voting what they think are their values instilled in them by either their faith traditions or their upbringing of some sort, or their family influences. We're never going to separate all that out, and I don't know that we need to or want to. But I do think that when it comes to me standing in a pulpit and saying, you need to vote for Bernie Sanders, or you need to vote for Hillary Clinton, or you should not vote for Donald Trump, which would have been, the things I would have wanted to say if I were going to say those things. But I think that would be wrong, because quite frankly, in my congregation, I have had delegates to Ron Paul. I've had delegates to Barack Obama. I've had delegates to Hillary Clinton. I've had delegates to other Republican candidates. And I have people that do not care one lick about the political process in our country. So how can I be a pastor to them if what I'm doing is telling them what their political leanings have to be? What I would like to do as a minister is to persuade them to care about things that are related to people who are poor, related to how we as a society can end things like systemic poverty, how we can end injustice and racism, how we can tackle things like detention centers that are holding people for profit. And to me, those are immoral. And so I want to stand up in the pulpit and talk about how those impact or how those are addressed by our faith understanding. But I don't need to support a particular candidate or oppose a particular candidate in order to do that. Because as a minister, I also want to be able to stand on the pulpit and say Barack Obama's drone wars were destructive and killed innocent people, and that too is immoral. So I may have a political leaning, a political party that best represents what I want to see done in our country as a citizen of this country, and it may be informed by my faith understanding, but I'm not going to stand up in a pulpit and support a particular candidate or denigrate a particular candidate, because people are smart. They're real smart. And they can come to their own conclusions, and it's up to them to figure out what aligns with who they are, what they believe, and their faith tradition. So I'll leave it at that and let other people start. I'll go from there.
Thank you, Mary. Okay, so keep your questions and comments in mind, and we'll get back to them after the end of the panel discussion. Next up on the panel is Rabbi Neil Blumoff. He's Senior Rabbi of Congregation Agudas Haim.
That's close
enough. In Austin. He's also on the Executive Board of Texas Freedom Network, immediate past president of the Interfaith Action of Central Texas, Senior Fellow at the Hartman Institute of Jerusalem, Rabbis Without Border Fellow, member of the Institute for Jewish Spirituality, and he also curates and produces Views and Brews jazz series on Cactus Cafe for KUT Radio. Public conversations, performances, exploring jazz and spirituality. Rabbi.
Thanks. I would stand up. I've been standing up for the last 5 hours, but it's a Shabbat joke. Nobody? Okay, so... But since... All right, I'll stand up. Thank you all very much for being here this afternoon and for engaging in this civil discourse about meaning and about significance of our society. And anything that has Lyndon Johnson, I like to connect to. It's a very. It was one of the first books that I was received when I came to Austin in 1998, which was the first volume of the Robert Caro series of the biography of Lyndon Johnson, and it was given to me ostensibly to trace sort of like where we were geographically on the Edwards Plateau. But as a student of politics and history and economics, I kept reading and have been reading ever since. And it's a very eye-opening. If you haven't, I guess I will endorse something. I'm going to come out and say that reading is really great. And if you'd like to so I think that it's and from what I understand, like that I may have this incorrect, but it was as an amendment in as it passed in 1954, and then it was later actually written into the tax code in the 1980s during Reagan's presidency. So it's actually in the tax code now. It's not just some amendment that's hanging out. It's actually part and parcel of our taxes. So that's just, I think that's a very important thing, that it may have been passed during Eisenhower's term. And we can actually, Mike, I didn't know that backstory about Johnson and the way that he actually won the Senate seat from Coke Stevenson in the first place. We might want to ban other things too. So, like box number 13 from Alice. But anyway, I believe that the theologians have said, both Christian, Jewish, and otherwise, have said that the goal of religion, or the purpose of religion, is to comfort the afflicted and to afflict the comfortable. That's the whole idea. And I think that, I don't know about you, but my holy space in the synagogue is called a sanctuary. So a sanctuary, if you think about what that means for a moment, it's not a gladiator den. That's not what it means. But the idea is that, at least as I understand it, in the Jewish tradition, we have a cycle of readings that we read throughout the year. So we're kind of inspired, if you want to use that word, each week by the stories that we tell, whether it's from the book of Genesis or Exodus, which are some of the more narrative functions of things, versus, let's say, the book of Leviticus, other things going on in Leviticus. So each, thank you, my guy. Leviticus. So the idea is that within each week we have a boundary or a conversation already made that can hopefully bring alive sacred texts and applying them to our general position. And I guess as a student of history also, maybe you would agree, those of you with some experience, is that you sort of look at contemporary events without minimizing people's efforts. It's kind of the same as it ever was. You kind of if you read sermons from the 19th century, and I love, Mary, the idea that we're going to eradicate systemic poverty. Deuteronomy says very clearly, you'll never eradicate poverty, you just have to deal with the poverty that is among you, which I think is either very exhausting or is a hopefully a sense of comfort that we can only do the best that we can. Judaism also has a couple of ideas about government, which there's lots to be said about that. However, I would say, as I spoke this morning, as we just began the book of Exodus, with, I'm not going to preach, I'm just but the book of Exodus where there was Joseph. Don't want to ruin it for you if you haven't read it, but Joseph was a very successful advisor to the Pharaoh, and then he and his family were very successful, and then you turn the page into the new book, and there was a new Pharaoh who did not know Joseph's accomplishments and made things very bad very quickly for the Hebrews, enslaving them and killing their children. So it was a very important shift, and Judaism speaks about this and later and says, be wary of the authorities, because they will only befriend you if it's in their interest to befriend you. That's on one hand. On the other hand, it also says, work within a system that has a governing body. Because if people were left to their own devices, they would eat each other alive.
Yes.
So we live within both of those ideas too. So that's important, and we can speak about the Johnson Amendment specifically. Let me just say this, that as maybe you've done some traveling like I have, if you've been to countries that have actually state-sponsored religion, wherever that may be, Christian, Jewish, or Muslim, it would be an extraordinary society that does not make things, let me say it this way, it would be an extraordinary society that would make equality a plank of that decision. So I think that it's important to understand that, as I understand it, that so-called wars on Christmas are manufactured. I do believe that. And we can, I'll maybe go out the side entrance after here. But the understanding is that if we have state-sanctioned or state-sponsored or weaponizing, if I'm going to use that word, or mobilizing churches, synagogues, mosques, whatever, into a place where candidates can feel that it's their fiefdom, then it's no longer a sanctuary. It's no longer a place where people can be thoughtful and engage in civil process passionately on issues on which they may not totally agree. Judaism is all about the questions. It's not about the answer. You don't get a piece of paper with a doxology that says, here you go, good luck to you. Judaism actually is all about what questions can we ask? What questions can we ask as we begin to think about the significance of our lives? And that requires, I think, an absence of personalities. And I think that as we, even Mike, I'm getting to know you, even if we begin to sort of channel our humanity into what pop culture or the news or the pundits tell us to think about, whether it's books or anything else, we're falling into a trap. I think we fall into a trap if we begin to base our identity against or mirrored by those who are in power. And if we are interested in specific certain issues that some candidates or politicians purport, that's great, and maybe there's common ground. But I think that our wisdom traditions, all of our wisdom traditions, are saying that it's the people themselves more than the politicians that matter, and the issues that we care so mightily about are going to be the issues that are there long after those politicians are out of office. So I think that we fall into a crevice or a trap if we begin to sacrifice the privilege that we have of speaking on particular people as opposed to issues. The other thing that I would say, and I think a criticism of against the Johnson Amendment of repealing the Johnson Amendment would be the last thing I want. It's hard to be a religious leader anyway. It's hard to infuse significance and purpose into religion. But if you see religion or a synagogue or a church as a shill for a particular place or party, you're not doing yourself any favors by attracting more people to what's more important. So in sum, I believe traditions are important, and any talented minister or imam or rabbi will be able to draw out of a particular study of sacred text something that is relevant for the people. And I do believe that if we fancy ourselves as spokespeople for people who may not care about us as their first priority, I think we're doing that at our own peril. So as we think about things, we have enough PACs, we have enough interest groups, we have enough people who gather and engage in politics for their own purposes. I think sanctuaries, to come back to what I said, sanctuaries should be sanctuaries, which doesn't mean that it should be sort of a park or it should be the blasé. It should be a beautiful basis and landscape on which we can discuss issues while we care about each other more than we care about people who so think that they have our interests at heart.
Thank you, Rabbi. Everyone's doing a wonderful job of walking up to the line and not crossing over, criticizing or endorsing any specific candidate. Next up, we have Sheikh Yasser Fazaga. He was born in Eritrea in Northeast Africa, moved to the United States at the age of 15. He has a bachelor's degree in Islamic studies, a master's degree in psychotherapy, and is working on a master's in theology at Loyola Marymount University. He is a multilingual speaker, giving lectures and teaching courses from the USA through Canada, Middle East, and Far East, and we're glad he could join us today.
Yasser.
Thank you. Rabbi, you do Hebrew?
You can do it in Hebrew, that's great.
אני יכול לדבר עברית. I always wanted to do that publicly, like to say.
I endorse that.
I actually just finished my first semester at UT doing Hebrew, and I'm really excited because I used to say I speak half of the Semitic language in the world. I speak Arabic, Tigray, and Tigrinya, the 6 Semitic language, and now I can say I also do Hebrew as well, so that puts me at 60% of the Semitic language. So it's good to be here. So I have an OCD. I like to read bumper stickers, and I'm not sure if anybody else does that. And I get to cars very close with a bumper sticker, and sometimes I think some of the bumper stickers are made for me. If you can read this, you're too close. I really just killed myself to get behind you. Upsetting people in the process and try to make amendments. I give them the peace sign and they give me back half of the peace sign. But one of my favorite bumper stickers echoes what Reverend Mary said earlier. It reads, if what you believe in does not impact how you behave, then what you believe in is not important. And the idea that I can somehow be a part-time religious person in certain matters, but others matters not, that becomes very difficult to do. Especially for people, and I guess that goes to most religious communities out there. A Muslim is somebody who willingly and lovingly submits to the will of God all the time. So you're constantly looking for what would God want me to do, what would God be pleased with so much, or as I do things. And that is why separating the spiritual from the secular is such a difficult thing to do for us in the Muslim community. There is actually any act qualifies to become a spiritual act if people approach it with the right intention. And as such, you can do anything and it would be deemed to be a spiritual act. So they have the joke, the husband and the wife, first week of marriage, they decided to split the work amongst them. So the husband said that he was going to do all the spiritual work in the household. And the wife was going to do all the secular work in the household. And in the first week, the husband ended up doing everything. Because everything qualifies to become a spiritual experience. So coming from that, and also to add to it, historically speaking, it seems like Muslims did very well when politics and religion somehow were in sync with one another. So when Muslims would speak about the glorious days of what Islam was like, they would speak about Spain, which also happened to be the golden era for both Judaism and Islam, with Moses Maimonides and other Muslim scholars, living in Spain together and debating amongst themselves. However, I think that the fear is when you have got religion marrying politics, that becomes a problem. And unfortunately, what we see, and maybe I can just put a global spin into this rather than just focusing on the American experience, which is the struggle nowadays within the Muslim community. I'm talking about the global Muslim community. So on the one hand, you've got a country like Saudi Arabia that boasts about, we implement all the teachings of Islam. But then when you look into the other things that are happening within a country that boasts about being religiously guided, it becomes very problematic to see that or even to appreciate that. And that becomes a huge deal of concern. So it is one of the richest countries, yet about 25% of the population lives under the poverty line. So as we in the Muslim community trying to find this idea of how much separation do we need and how much involvement can we have. But the agreement here is that religion and politics ought not to be married. That ought to be a very illegal relationship that should not be taking place. Very similar to Judaism, Islam also has ideas about governance, and it is mostly about principles. So it states clearly in the Quran, for example, the Quran is the book that Muslims believe to be the literal word of God, would be that the job of the governance body would be to facilitate for morality, eliminate poverty. Actually, it is believed that it can be eliminated, or at least a certain level of poverty can be eliminated, promote justice, and discourage injustice. And that would be how things ought to be governed, or these would be the principles that would be guiding whoever is in the place of authority. Similarly, as imams, as theologians, scholars, even though in Islam there is really no concept of clergymen. So I am not an imam because somebody ordained me to become as such. What happens is that you go and you study, and if the community feels that you are qualified to lead, then out of respect they would call you the imam, which means that you know a little bit more than the average person when it comes to the theology of the religion. But here's what we've been taught as imams. He said that if you see an imam on the doorsteps of the king, the queen, or whoever it is, said, question their integrity. That is not where they belong. Knocking on their doors should only be for the sake of criticizing them and standing up for the people, not to have that, lovey-dovey type of a relationship. But this idea of, as people who supposedly not speak on behalf of God, but teach the word of God, said that your relationship with the authority, there's got to be a distance, and you can never be in bed with them, like the rabbi said earlier. So these are some of the debates that are taking place within our community. And then the last part that I just want to say specifically about the Muslim community, because of what is going on, the Muslim community seems to be very captivated by the topics that are of immediate importance to the community. And understandably so at this point. The Patriot Act, for example, and the consequences of the Patriot Act. The ban on the, it's not called a ban on Muslims, but whatever the ban and the consequences of it are the different tweets that we receive when the perpetrator is a Muslim versus when the perpetrator is somebody else, and the reaction that we get from the White House. So these would be the topics that would be expected of an imam to address when they are taking place. And when I speak to our community, I refer to this as a group selfishness, because at this point we are against the way that the FBI treats the Muslim community. I said, well, wait a minute, where were we when other communities were protesting against police brutality? How come we really did not say anything then? You speak about immigrations. Hey, wait a minute, what happened to the Haitian community when they were being sent back? How come nobody stood up for them? So the idea that we only want to stand up for our kind, for our people, for our own, is just unacceptable. And that is when we speak about, justice for all, and ought not to be guilty of group selfishness. So these are just initial thoughts to share with you. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, That's busy writing down your jokes. And our last panel member is Reverend Brian Ferguson. He's currently the third year as the minister of the Wildflower Unitarian Universalist Church in South Austin. Prior to that, he served in churches in San Marcos, Cedar Park, Central Austin. Prior to that, he worked 24 years as an electronic design engineer and project manager. He holds a Master's of Divinity degree from Starr King, which is the Unitarian Universalist Seminary in Berkeley, and a BS Honors degree in Applied Physics from the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow, Scotland, and that background will be very obvious when you hear us speak. I kid with him because I'm a member of his congregation. Fairness and disclosure here. Brian.
Thank you very much. I have a question for Mike, since he is a congregant. You said that with too much conformity, you were going to push it. I thought the name of this organisation was Common Ground. Well, something I want. Being the last person speaking, I kind of agree and endorse everything that was said. So I'm trying to find unique things to say that hasn't been said. And first off, unlike Russell, I barely speak one language, as you'll probably notice. So if any of you are having trouble with my accent, yes, sir, I'll translate. Thank you. If you can understand me. But being a Unitarian Universalist minister, we're often classified as the slightly religious wing of the Democratic Party. And so the idea of politics and religion being tied together, it's a water of swimming. I can't imagine not. And I think we heard a lot from people here that, how can you, as a religious person, have these values and not practice them politically? It doesn't seem possible. And there's a Russian thinker, Nikolai Beredev. He said that bread for myself is a material issue. Bread for my neighbour is a spiritual one. Bread for my neighbour is a spiritual one. And I think that goes to the heart of what justice work is. Because if you're just out for your own self-interest, which most of us are to some degree, but if you're only out for your self-interest, then that is a material issue. When you're out for the interest of others, and Yasser spoke about, what about those people that don't look like you, not the same gender, not the same sexual orientation, not the same nationality? Are you out for bread for them as you wish for yourself? Are you out for the same rights for them as you want for yourself? That is religious people professing their values for other people in the political realm, and I think that's completely valid, and I see no concern with that. And as a Unitarian Universalist, the whole idea of tax-exempt status is very important. I mean, Mike mentioned the Johnson Amendment. In 2004 in Texas, the comptroller took away our tax-exempt status as Unitarian Universalists from the Red River Church, because he said that we weren't a religious organisation because we had no one common belief. That happened, that lasted for about a week. And all these people came forward, the ACLU, the Separation for Justice, say, we'll do this case for free, and we'll do it. But really the purpose was, I think the comp controller, who was a Republican at that time, and we are known as a very progressive liberal organisation, religion, and most social issues were in the progressive liberal side. I don't think they ever thought that was going to last. I think it was a warning shot across our bows to be cautious of how political we get. I don't know that for a fact, but the fact that someone would even do that, I mean, is religion defined by having one common belief? I would imagine in all your congregations there's no one common belief. There's different interpretations of it. So I think, now for me, I think it's very important, like, what is religion about? And I often say to a congregation, and Mike's tired of hearing this, is, I think for me religion is about what do you love and what breaks your heart? What do you love and motivates you and inspires you? And what breaks your heart as you look around the world around us? That is ultimately what religion's about. And whether God is part of that question, that's up to the individual. And ultimately for me, how that manifests itself is, I want to transform myself and our congregation through search for meaning, and transform the world through acts of love. And transforming the world through acts of love takes us very much into the justice area. And the mission statement for Wildflower Church, which Mike and I are part of, is growing spiritually together, spreading love, justice and joy. I even have it at the back of that t-shirt. So it's spreading love, justice and joy. I mean, ultimately that's what it's about. It's bringing more love into the world. A love that I interpret as the love of God. My role as a religious person is to bring that love and make it manifest and embody it in the world around us. I think as Cornel West, the African-American theologian, said that, justice is love made public. Justice is love made public. So I think that's very important that we think of, we relate that, because justice is not an end in itself. Love is to just bring that beloved community into our world. It's not an end in itself, it's just a path to bringing more love into this world. And the Brazilian Archbishop held in Carlin said that when I feed the poor, they call me a saint. And when I ask why they are poor, they call me a communist. And I think some people like religion when it's involved in politics as long as they agree with what they're doing. But when they don't like what they're doing, then they don't think there's a place for religion. And I completely endorse what Mary said. I endorse Mary as a political candidate. No, I can't. I endorse what Mary said. That I am glad there's organisations that are out there that are saying abortion's wrong. Because it's raising important questions. They are living their beliefs in the public space. I think they're right to do that. Our denomination, I think abortion's a very complex issue, but we really do go for reproductive justice as an issue. I think it's hugely complex. But the fact is that debate's out there is important, because just as a free press is very important in keeping government accountable, I think religious organisations and voluntary organisations like churches and non-profits, it's very important to keep government and all institutions of power accountable. I think it's a role, because we as individuals can have very little influence on these big institutions of power. We need to get together in groups, Texas Freedom Network, and various other organisations that I've been involved with. We go to the state capitol, we go up to the senators and the state senators and representatives, and I've had arguments with them about various issues. I think it's also very important as religious leaders that we're up front about issues that where religion has been, in my view, on the wrong side of issues, like the LGBTQ community. It's very important for me as a religious leader, especially as a heterosexual religious leader, being out there saying it was wrong. The lesbian, gay, bisexual community deserve the same rights I have for same-sex marriage. I was up there opposing the transgender bathroom bill as well. That was picking one of the most vulnerable parts of our community and scapegoating them for political reasons. And I think it's important for religious leaders to be up there in front. It is moral, and I'm a values voter. As a progressive, liberal, religious leader, I'm a values voter just as other religious people are values voters as well. And I think it's very important to see that our values, that we come from a religion, need to be part of the political debate. And one other thing regarding the Johnson Amendment, I think there's some value to it in the sense that it forces me as a minister when I'm in the pulpit to give that more thought to what I say. I've never endorsed a candidate. I've just... It's all out. But as Michael said, I've often critiqued policies of any, I've critiqued Barack Obama, I've critiqued Clinton, I've critiqued Donald Trump, you might be surprised to hear. But that is an important role as a minister, as a prophetic leader. You look at the Hebrew scriptures, the prophets were always criticising the power. And it's important because we do need institutions and leaders to critique power, and that's an important role. One other thing about the Johnson Amendment, I don't think it's been enforced. So I think this is a little bit of a red herring, the whole repealing it. Because in 2011, the minister of the First Baptist Church of Dallas released a video of endorsing Governor Perry for president. He released that as a video. It was sent to the IRS. Nothing happened. So the idea that I choose not to endorse, I'm not sure my congregation would actually listen to me, even if I did. But the fact is, I choose not to do it. I'll critique policy and I'll promote what I think is the best values for our community. But the endorsing candidate, I think, is a bit of a no-no. The other thing I want to talk about is the tax-exempt status, because that's very important when we talk about the separation of church and state. There's actually 4 elements to the tax-exempt status of religious organisations, and And 3 of them are typical of non-profit, and two of them are typical of non-profit, one's not. One is churches and religious institutions and synagogues do not pay property tax. They also, donations to it are tax exempt. The couple that I struggle with is we often don't have to renew our non-profit status. Any of you who are involved in the non-profit world often have to renew your non-profit status. Religious institutions don't need to do that with the IRS. But the one I really have had trouble with, and I take advantage of this, so I'm hypocritical here, so I hope you appreciate the honesty. As ministers and leaders, we get housing allowance, which is not tax deductible for federal taxes. No other non-profit group gets that. And that troubles me. That seems to be a kind of special government treating religions as special, which I have a problem with. I think the fact that we have tax exempt status for property tax and for donations is a healthy separation of church and state, which is not influenced. But there does seem to be some special rights for me as a religious leader getting tax exempt status for housing allowance. And that seems dubious. So I think the tax exempt status and political involvement is important. And I think as long as we stay purely the same as a 501c3 non-profit, then I think that's fair. I think when we start getting special dispensations as religions, we need to look at that. And I'll finish there.
Thank you. Can I ask the audience, did you understand what you were saying about tax-exempt housing allowance? When you
I'm actually nodded there the first time.
So is that?
I think you said not tax exempt the first time you said it, but you corrected yourself.
It's actually somewhat complicated. Ministers' tax is crazy. A lot of accountants don't even fool with it because they're so complicated. You get to designate part of your financial package from the congregation or faith community as housing allowance, and then you file a self-employment tax, and then part of that is deducted from the self-employment tax, and then part of that is deducted from your federal income tax, and it's percentages of percentages of percentages, and it's not at all clear from the get-go exactly how that's going to work. I actually, when I first started as a minister, had the IRS ask me to prove the validity of what I was requesting as housing allowance, and I had to send them, my mortgage, proof of what my mortgage was, my electric bill, gas bills, etc., and then they approved it, and they haven't asked me again since. There is a judge who has ruled in federal court that this is unconstitutional, and it has been upheld at least one time. I think the housing allowance is going to disappear fairly quickly, and if it does, it'll change my taxes by probably $2,000, $3,000, $4,000 of an increase. I happen to think the judge is probably right, even though it's going to hurt me financially. But.
And I think if you've got one to give anyone's advice who's going into ministry for the first career, rather than apply physics and math, become a tax accountant.
Actually, here's another unique aspect of being a minister. When you first start as a minister, you have the option to opt out of Social Security based upon religious objections. I could not think of one religious objection to Social Security, so I did not opt out. So, yeah, it's weird. I don't know. Anyway, so I actually, in the past 15, 16 years I've been a minister, I've also been paying into Social Security, and then we'll receive benefits from it. There are some churches that then have, as part of their minister's package, a Social Security offset to pay the pastors back for what they contribute. It's just the weirdest profession in terms of pay and taxes and this church state. And let me just point out just one thing real quick. Whenever we say separation of church and state, we are automatically assuming Christianity, because no other faith community calls a religious place of worship a church. So let's just make sure we understand that there's an assumption even in the language there that implies Christianity.
Just a little history. The housing allowance was brought in late 19th century because it used to be ministers would get a parsonage with the church, and it was when that stopped to happen, there was another way of compensating ministers. That's the history behind it. There's a lot more, but I'm sure that's more than you wanted to know.
Isn't Social Security a communist?
Probably, but
Event value. Okay.
yeah.
As the panel moderator, I get to ask one follow-up question, then we'll open it up for audience participation. And I actually did some research on the background of some views on this, and it turns out a number of surveys were done with evangelical groups, and by far the vast majority of people from that group did not want their pastors to talk about partisan political issues from the pulpit. They wanted their church to be a sanctuary. However, the vast majority also did not want the government monitoring what was said in their church, passing judgment on what was okay, what was not okay, and punishing their church if they decided they crossed over the line. So they were against keeping the Johnson Amendment on those grounds. The alternative explanation, the one I like the best, is the idea of separation of church and state is, some say, one of the great innovations early in our country's founding. And we have evolved a set of rules and principles and behaviors to kind of make that practical. And what we have now more or less works with the Johnson Amendment and the various tax rules. So let's keep that, because alternatives could actually be much more problematic. And I'll give any of the panel members a chance to comment on that, either of those issues if they want. Then we'll open it up.
Could you repeat the specific?
The evangelical view that they don't want this preached from their particular church, but they don't want the government telling what other churches could or could not do. And the second one was, well, this seems to work.
Well, let me just comment that I have people tell me in my congregation the very same thing. You know, they don't want politics preached from my pulpit either, and I don't necessarily, I mean, I grew up in the evangelical tradition, don't necessarily consider myself in that anymore, but I have had people tell me, you're getting too political. And that's when I've talked about things like the water politics of the Standing Rock tribe. When I've talked about the neo-Nazis and KKK, situation in Charlotte. I actually had somebody leave the church because of my positions on that, and left incredibly angry at me. Now, for me, I was talking about social justice. I was talking about racism, and I was talking about the idea of fairness and that sort of thing that I think are religious values to me. But this person that was left very angry at me thought that I was simply denigrating his heritage in a political way. So you talk to clergy that are, to the left, which I clearly am. We don't get a free pass on people complaining about us being religious or political and religious and so on. Even if we don't specifically name religious policies or candidates, even if the topic just hints sometimes at a political topic, we can still get grief for it. And I continue to try to couch my sermons about justice and in our sacred text, and that is not always sufficient for some people's opinions. I mean, what I will hear sometimes is, I don't come to church for that, I want to just come to church to be inspired. And my response is, well, I want you to be inspired to go out and do the right thing. So it's never a clean-cut issue. Ministers have people get upset with us for all kinds of reasons, and sometimes surprisingly so. Sometimes you can't predict what those reasons are going to be. But yeah, so coming from the evangelical tradition, knowing the mindset, having family members that still are there, this last election was a difficult election for them because they have a political point of view, but they also have a moral point of view, and those two were not necessarily in sync for them in this election, and they found it a very difficult one to decide on how to vote and how to articulate their faith perspective.
That's so weird, Mary, because my community, there's no controversy. And I appreciate you, Mike, asking that question. And I think, as one who knows a little history about the Jewish presence in different countries and being a chronic minority pretty much everywhere, we recognize that wherever you want to drop the needle, that the community is really only as safe as the present administration, whether it's a monarchy or otherwise. So I think that putting one's faith in a ruling government doesn't always, never predicts the safety of a group. There's a really interesting book that you might be interested in, since you're pro-reading. Is a professor at the University of Chicago named David Nierenberg, who wrote a book just called Anti-Judaism. And it's a book that chronicles sort of just the Western understanding, built-in bias against folks who are not the similar people. And I just think it's an interesting idea, recognizing that it's not just in a religious role, that it's sort of built into philosophy and political thinking and otherwise, that whether you're reading St. Augustine or Hegel or whoever you're reading. And it's just and I think that also whether you're looking at scriptures or whether you're just looking at modern history of the 20th century, you can recognize how quickly cultures and societies change. If you, again, just open up or just scratch a certain bit, and you can sort of see, as we're dealing with, as we all are dealing with, the explosion of hatred that you find in social media and otherwise. And I think it's something that you'd mentioned. Certain groups. There's a group called the Anti-Defamation League, the ADL, which has been working overtime in trying to combat hate speech that we at present don't really have much of a good response to. But the thing that I just wanted to say specifically, since you opened it up, is I think that and maybe you won't like this, and that's fine. I think there is something special about American society. And I think that the grand American experiment that has come out of the founding of America is worth preserving. And whatever you understand as separation of church and state, and we can get into the arcane aspects of parsonage law if you're interested. but whatever, I mean, speaking on a more macro tone, I think that what American society has accomplished is very different than certainly European society, and for Jews that hasn't ended well. And certainly in Middle Eastern lands as well, which we can discuss. I think that the minority, as Yasser was saying, it's how you treat your most vulnerable, which I think determines your success as a group of people. And we can speak in an echo chamber of privilege and access and accountability. However, we need to go outside of ourselves, and whether using Judaism historically as an example, or looking around our city in Austin and sort of seeing who needs attention and help to combat the things that are causing insecurity, etc. I think that that's really, really important. And I would be very much part of the second part, which says that it may not be the best answer ever and why Johnson decided to do what he did. However, I think it's creaking along pretty well. And if you start nibbling at that kind of corrosiveness, I think quite quickly you'll find that, as William Faulkner said, that the past isn't the past, it's never even left. And I don't want to open some of those doors again. Not for me, not for Charlottesville, and not for anybody in this society. So I'm willing and wanting, and would publicly say and do, defend the grand experiment of America, as imperfect as it is.
Couldn't agree more with that statement. Definitely, especially for somebody like myself coming from where I come from, Northeast Africa, this is a beautiful experience and truly is worthy of preserving. In the Muslim community, though, the way that the government has been involved lately has been very interesting. So the belief in the community is that every mosque is monitored. That is a belief. Every mosque has got an informant into it. In fact, one case that is lingering at this point in the Ninth Circuit, sadly, if you Google my name, if you just write Fazaga, the very first entry is going to be Fazaga versus the FBI. We have a case where the government knowingly, intentionally sent an informant into our community, pretending to be a Muslim, somebody who has converted to Islam, and came in, and within 5 months he started speaking some crazy language. We need to do something, we can do this, I was in the military, I have access to this and access to that, and said, wait a minute, what in the world is going on? This is unacceptable, crazy talk. So I remember we called the FBI and we said, look, we think we have a terrorist amongst us. So the FBI said, well, what's his name? Craig Montiel. It's a all out in the open case. So the FBI said, oh, why don't you just call the local police department? We called the local police department. This is in Southern California, but a few years back. Case still open. So we called the local police department and said, look, we've got something who's talking some crazy stuff and we believe he's a terrorist. So the police department said, well, has he done anything? You want us to wait now? So it did not, nothing happened. The police department would not do anything about it. So we had to put the restraining order on that individual. And he was gone for a year, came back with a website, don'ttrustthefbi.anymore.com, and what happened is that he said, I'm an informant, I was never a Muslim, the FBI had a deal with me, but they really never fulfilled their promise to me, and he's very angry and bitter now, so he decided to tell it all. And what happened is the FBI decided that this is a mosque that was worthy of being monitored. It was actually in 5 of the mosques in Southern California. And the question was, why? Why did you do it? Why was the government involved at that level that they wanted our sermons to be recorded? They wanted our classes to be recorded. They wanted to see what was being taught. That kind of government involvement is absolutely brutal. Because if you belong to a religious organization, to many people, that is their second home. And as you know, the most important element in any healthy human relationship is trust. And the minute you start doing these kinds of things, you destroy the trust that is amongst the members in the community. Can I trust this person? Can I not trust this person? And at that point, you are ruining the fabric of the community. So that kind of involvement is what the Muslim community is really about at this point. So much so that even though it would be very legal for the Muslim community to discuss a lot of issues, but people hold back because they're afraid, well, who's doing the listening? How may somebody take selectively what I have been saying? So to the contrary, you see people just holding back rather than fully speaking their mind. And that is an issue that we have in the community at this point.
That breaks my heart. As someone who grew up in Scotland, where we have a lot of problems with religious bigotry between Protestants and Catholics, and actually drove me out of the church. I grew up Presbyterian. The separation of church and state, I think, is a very good thing. I mean, we had a public school system in the west of Scotland that was Protestant and Catholic public school system. And all it did was create tribalism and bigotry. And it got inflamed with the Northern Irish situation in the 1970s and 1980s. So I think the separation of church and state is part of that great American experiment that Rabbi Neil was talking about. So I think the separation of church and state is great. Regarding the people saying you talk too much politically, I even get that at Wildflower Church, where we are very social justice oriented. But I think my goal as a minister is to disappoint people at a rate they can tolerate. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you. We're going to open this up for questions and comments from the audience. Let me explain how this is going to work. First of all, I will call on people. I'll try and achieve at least geographical dispersion here around the room. Yes, you can ask questions of an individual panel member or the panel as a whole, or me if you want. Or feel free if you want, if you insist on making a comment and not a question, that's okay, but just keep it short, to the point, and be respectful of the fact that there'll be people in here who strongly disagree with you, probably. If you really feel strongly, we'll allow one follow-up question. What we do not want to do is have people start a one-to-one dialogue with one of the panel members. That just takes away from everyone else having a chance to have a discussion. And then we usually don't have an opportunity to get to everyone who wants to ask a question or make a comment. So we'll leave plenty of time at the end if you want to come forward and talk to individual panel members. You'll feel free to do that as we clean up afterwards. So with that, the first hand went up here.
Yes.
And you got a big room, so please stand.
So I had a question.
You know what would be great? To promote a little bit of civility, and you know our names, we'd love to know yours.
Okay, I'm Yvonne LaRue, very French, by the way.
Thank you.
Anyway, at some level, religion has gotten a bad name, okay, over the last so many years. And as I think about that, I think, well, why? I mean, I grew up in a very Catholic, but I'm very progressive too, so figure that one out. But anyway, my background, I think about it, and it appears, at least in the U.S., that religion, a religious organization, somebody claiming to be the head of a religious organization, doesn't really have a definition. Anybody, it seems, can go out and claim to the IRS and therefore start preaching, their particular religion. My question to the four of you is that, does the occupation of the real religious leaders, like the four of you, ever address that particular problem? The problem that you're getting a bad name as an overall thing, because there are people out there that are claiming to be something they're not. And the IRS is just, guess what? They don't have enough people. They probably aren't able to. Anyway.
Well, first of all, it's actually not as easy as it might sound for someone to make a claim to be a religious leader and get tax benefits. As I mentioned, I had to go through and prove that what I was trying to write off, and I wasn't getting paid squat. I was actually part-time at the time. So, compare that to somebody else who's got a $10 million mansion. So it's not quite as easy as it may sound. Somebody may present themselves as a religious leader and talk crazy stuff, but the IRS may not recognize them as a religious leader or a religious organization. So there's hoops to jump through. And the state of Texas, for instance, churches have exemption for sales taxes, and you have to submit paperwork, and it has to get approved, and so on. There's actually more to it than most people seem to know, quite frankly. But I was also asked a similar question at a political event recently about why Democrats in particular are not the party that's viewed to have religious voices in it. And part of my answer was like, I don't know. Why? Part of it has to do with the moral majority that I mentioned earlier back in the 80s with Ronald Reagan, and this view that the Republican Party was voicing their religious concerns. A lot of it has to do with what we've called the social, culture wars, the LGBTQ divisions. For the longest time, being Republican meant that you were anti-marriage equality, you were anti-even civil union, you were anti-domestic partnership. Bottom line, we were going to hell if we were gay. And the religious left was saying that's not true, and for whatever reason, that religious right voice of squelching the religious left seemed to win for a time. And I'm hoping to be part of the religious left that changes that.
Yvonne, are you from Louisiana?
Yeah, I am.
Whereabouts?
My father's originally from New Orleans.
Nice. So I wish that the biggest issues we had were outliers, pretending to be or thinking that they were shadowing sort of a so-called established religious tradition. I think that and I'm very happy that I've had the privilege to teach at St. Edward's University, a Catholic institution. I currently am on faculty at the Austin Presbyterian Theological Seminary. And we've had very honest, open debates about just the religious and sacred texts that are shared, whether the Hebrew Bible or the Christian Bible, etc., and how established religions can perhaps set up biases against those neighbors of theirs. And so, if somebody's out there, praying to, something that's, everyone kind of thinks, whatever that looks like. But the idea that how religion can be used as a bludgeon to promote hatred and difficulty and tribalism, as was said, I think that's much more of a pressing issue, which is why I'm so involved in the interfaith work here in the city.
Well, and that really is addressing my question, because that is an issue right there. What I'm asking is, as a group, are y'all trying to combat this problem? Because let's face it, even the evangelicals are saying, but these loud voices are not really us. These ones that are not for equality, that are not, they don't help their neighbor. I mean, every religion is.
Yeah, although I would say that...
That's a follow-up, by the way.
Yeah. At 75% roughly, the evangelical Christians voted for Roy Moore in Alabama. And 75% of white women who are evangelical identified voted for Roy Moore. On the other hand, 75% of white women who do not identify as evangelical voted for Doug Jones. So there is a religious divide, and I think there is some onus, which is one of the reasons I'm running for an office, some onus on the religious left to get the message out that there is another way. And I've been invited to speak to organizations who are typically evangelical but don't feel at home any longer in the Republican Party and are looking for another voice. And they are thrilled to death that there is another voice. And I have had people tell me that they've never heard a Christian minister talk about social justice the way I have while I've been out on the political trail. That would say that we have done a terrible job of getting our message out. So I'm hoping to change that.
I think it's also hard to get attention with a moderate position. I think extreme positions get attention, get the press, and and it's sometimes even hard to get passionate about a moderate position. And I see both sides of that. You say passionately. So I think, I think one of the problems is that religion has become known about more about what it hates than what it loves. You look at the press out there, they're critical of the LGBTQ community, they're critical of this, that, and the other, and that's the voice of the religion that's out there. And I think, I don't want to speak for everyone, but I suspect everyone in this would be promoting what we love, what we think is great, what's beautiful, what's life-affirming and life-enhancing about the world. But that doesn't always get the press. But I was told in San Marcos, 35 miles south of here, I was a minister there for 5 years. I was told by a Christian minister, I don't identify as Christian, I was told by a Christian minister that I was the devil because I did same-sex weddings. He said that to me, and I wasn't allowed to become part of the Ministers Association down there because I didn't identify as a Christian. So once you get outside of Austin, things change quite rapidly. San Marcos is college town. So it's hard to get your voice heard a lot of the time as a more moderate liberal position because, and my wife tells me, say you're a Unitarian Universalist minister, don't say you're a minister. She doesn't want that label to be, burdened on me.
In the Muslim community, like I said earlier, there is no concept of clergymen. So the idea that as an imam being an occupation is actually something that is just recent. Imams, historically speaking, were not supposed to to be paid for being imams. That is not how you made a living. That's not something that was actually frowned upon greatly. However, at this point, you just could not be an imam and be able to provide a living on the side. As such, it became this. But I think also something else that came as a result of this is, for whatever reason, religious leaders, we get 100% trust and 0% accountability. And to me, that's very dangerous. I'm a therapist, and I have gone through the training of becoming a therapist. But people trust their religious leaders. You go to the rabbi, you go to the minister, because people trust them. And it's like some of the advices that are given to the congregation or to members, I'm saying, what was he thinking? When that individual made that statement. But it's the 100% trust and 0% accountability. So it is that idea of where these impressions may be coming from. And also the other thing is, at least what I try to do, is challenge the status quo. And that is, imams and religious leaders are not necessarily infallible. They are there to help us understand, but they are fully capable of making mistakes and being wrong as well. In the Muslim community, and you see with the violence that is being perpetrated in the name of Islam, there is usually some sort of a religious edict or a religious okay behind it. And people are usually asking, is this true? And basically it is the same what's been happening historically, and that is selective reading of the scripture. Somebody has taken parts of whatever book it is, because we can make any book say what we want it to say, including any book. Bible, Quran, you just name it. We can make any book say what we want it to say, and we do this by the process of a selective reading of the scripture. So I think something that I'm truly passionate about is to let people, my congregation, to let them know it's okay to read the book on their own. It is okay not to be dependent on the imam. It is okay to actually see that it is God talking to you and see what it is being said to you. So I think, on my part, I just love to hand people back the power of think for yourself.
Phil.
I'm Phil. You sounded like Martin Luther. Oh no. First Unitarian Church of Dallas has a parsonage. Wildflower doesn't have a parsonage. Mike, you gonna do something about that? I grew up Catholic, so I grew up with the Nicene Creed. So in the 4th century, the church, which was the same as the government, decided here is the truth. And even today, I hope there are no Episcopalians here. The Episcopal Church, which is the Church of England in casual dress, recites the Nicene Creed. Here is what you must believe, or at least say that you believe, in order to be a member of this church, to be a Christian. That is a creed. Well, if you go to Tel Aviv or Jerusalem, you will find some pretty serious fundamentalists. You go to Saudi Arabia, you'll find Wahhabis, and Pakistan you'll find Taliban, and sections of India and Myanmar you will find extremists. So these are people who have a creed. Pat Robertson and Mike Pence are the kind of people who do not believe in the separation of what I know that God wants and the state. They're everywhere. They're not just in Saudi Arabia, they're right here in Texas. So what I don't quite understand is that I think that 3 of you, I'll omit the Unitarian, I think that 3 of you are religious. I think that means you have a creed of some kind. Maybe it's a more progressive creed than Pat Robertson or Wahhabis, but it is a creed, I think. And so I don't understand how, since a a creed is a set of beliefs, and a set of beliefs leads to a set of values, right? How you cannot wish to impose your values upon the state. How can you call yourself religious and not wish to impose your values? Because, hey, I'm not religious, and I definitely want to impose my values upon the state.
Okay. Quick question.
So Phil, thank you. As I was speaking before, maybe it wasn't clear, is that in Judaism there is no what you call a creed, or I call it a doxology. It's actually the questions that matter. So you'd be hard-pressed to find written down. You might find certain attempts, as Yasser was talking about, Maimonides, who maybe wanted to boil it down into a tweet, right? But the understanding is that if you look at our sacred texts, beyond the Hebrew Bible or the Torah, you get a 63-volume set called the Talmud, which is all about the question. It's all about the conversation. So, that may be from a particular vantage point that you're speaking about. However, what particular values, I think would be embedded, at least for me, within the democracy of American living. So, freedom, equality, goodness, that sort of thing that we find in amazing documents like the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. I'm a big fan of that. If you're saying that, that Judaism, for example, since you called out three of us, is trying to impose some sort of, fundamentalist stain on the state, I think you would be mistaken.
Now it's down to 2.
I don't impose values in the state. And in fact, let me just finish it. Much of what we do as Jewish people is have to respond to a majority culture as well, which, is fine, but it's not exactly what, we necessarily want to be doing, and it's interesting, I was just traveling out in the Guadalupe Mountains, which I like to do. I like to camp a lot, and then we drove into Carlsbad for an evening, just at the city. There's this amazing, Christmas scene, with lights and nativity and all. It's great. And we were circling around, and then in the corner there's the little menorah. Lovely, and it's a beautiful statement. Does it belong there? Religious? I don't know, but it's a beautiful way of Americans recognizing that we're all in this together somehow.
Well, I'm pretty sure Madison and Jefferson were not Jewish.
You could make a case that they weren't Christian either.
No, I think they were. I think they did consider themselves Christian, and I think they were.
I'm not so sure they did. That's another conversation.
Jefferson makes a lot of statements which show that he valued the idea of the separation of religion and politics. He was clear on that. But I think he and Madison and all of the founders really did want to impose their values upon, and they wrote a constitution which reflected their values. I happen to agree with their values, but I think that they were not the values that were universal in the world at that time.
Yeah, well, when we think about values, liberty and justice for all are not in conflict in any way with my religious beliefs. I think that they go together quite well. And in terms of imposing, I come from a congregational background, and in congregational and free church tradition, we actually don't have creeds. We may recite some of the historic creeds on occasions, but we don't recite creeds in my congregation as a matter of course, like some of the Episcopal, Catholic, even Lutheran traditions do. So should not assume that all Christians have the same sort of creedal basis, because I've never been part of a church my entire life that was considered creedal in nature. But the imposition of one's faith is, I think, an incredibly dangerous thing. And I wanted to bring up something. Joe Biden is Catholic, and so is Paul Ryan. Very different politics, right? So being Catholic does not necessarily tell someone what your political leanings are going to be. And I was going to say one thing in terms of imposing. What I want is for people in this country to be able to practice the religious faith in freedom and in security, safety, and that sort of thing. And I also want people who are not religious to be able to not practice without some litmus test about whether they are then fit to be part of public life. And I'll give you examples of how I go about that. The treasurer for my political campaign is an atheist. In my congregation yesterday, for the first time, there was a Muslim community that did Friday afternoon prayers with no barriers in an egalitarian way, because they were looking for a space in which to do that, and my congregation said, we would like to offer our space. The third Friday of every month, we have a Jewish community that gathers together for a Shabbat service, a potluck. So in the space that is the sanctuary of my church, people of multiple faiths and people of no faith come together for common purposes, whether that be prayer, whether that be something you would even call worship, whether that be for seeking out a way to find their own spiritual path, or whether that be as a place to be inspired to work for justice. But I think that a person of faith does not necessarily need to be a person that imposes top-down their particular values on everyone else. But I think a person of faith can be one who is really interested, like I am, in dialogue and understanding and looking for what the name of this is, common ground. Because I do think there is a ton of common ground across our belief systems. I think what makes, quite frankly, if I can go ahead and name someone, Ted Cruz dangerous as a politician is his dominionism theology. He really does want to impose a theocracy on our country. That's what dominionism is about in the Christian tradition, and I believe it's dangerous for the life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness and liberty and justice for all as Americans. And so I oppose him both politically and religiously for his views.
Thank you.
So in the Muslim tradition, we have two guiding principles. One explicitly says, La ikraha fi din, there is no compulsion in religion. You cannot impose upon others to have a relationship with God if they don't want to. And that is why literally the word Muslim means somebody who willingly and lovingly surrenders to the will of God. And that is why, for example, I find it very problematic, the whole notion of, can you impose a dress code upon people? The cases are in some Muslim countries, unfortunately, that is the case, where women are to dress in a specific way that is imposed by the state. Any system that thinks that they can impose morality by a set of rules is doomed to collapse, because these are the type of choices that can only be done as a result of a person's individual conscience. And when you have a state that is trying to impose this, it will definitely collapse. What I would want to do is exactly what Mary said, and that is, there are universal values that are going to ensure my rights as well as your rights. And these are the type of rights that we should all aspire for, that would ensure that you have your way of life without imposing it on me, and mine without imposing it on you. And this way I believe that we can all peacefully coexist if that takes place. The fact that I may have a creed, whatever that creed is, as long as I am not imposing it on others, I think that as a religious community, we're going to have our defining boundaries as to what that means. My fear is that we are going to set up walls that are going to separate us from the rest of those who are around us. And that would be what is going to be problematic. But as a Muslim, I love what I see here. And that is, the whole notion of whether you're religious or not, theist or an atheist, the fact that people can just be, that in itself is that experience that is truly worthy of preserving.
Can I make a quick comment, Mike?
Real quick. Okay, yeah, this has been
This will take
discussion so far?
This will take 20 seconds.
We talk afterwards. The consensus in the room is. Okay, Joanne, you want to help me pick someone back there?
Sure, there are a couple of people back here, all the way in the back.
Oh, okay. I was trying to be humble as I can. Yeah, my name is Rocky Bosher. I live in Wimberley. And in Wimberley, someone was talking about outside of Austin. In Wimberley, you have the Unity Church and you have everyone else. But that was supposed to be funny. You're all supposed to I come from I'm not going to use the word religion because I come from my spirituality from my addictive past. I'm an addict. So I come at it from a higher power, from creating my own spirituality, which has kept me sober for decades now. I have come across a guy out of the University of Kansas. He has written a book called When Religion Becomes an Addiction. I don't know, his name is Miner, his last name is Miner, and he has an institute up there. I think if we really want to, other than the economic aspect of why people are so, I believe, addicted to evangelical right-wing Christianity, is an economic thing, first of all. But also the fact that they have all the symptoms of addicts when you get in their face and they cannot handle it. They get defensive, they get judgmental, they get condemning, they get angry, they rage, and they basically just become dysfunctional beings. They don't think, and I think that we as sane, I shouldn't say sane, that's my own judgmental word, as thinking individuals, or as people that want to move towards a true spiritual way of thinking and living with our neighbors, we need to look at them as addicts because they are terrified. Their world is falling apart. Their neo-confederacy mentality is falling apart. Young people are not going to church. I'm not giving them a pass because a lot of the hate that they put out is despicable. So my question is, I want to be like him where I come. What do you think about that? And what church do you
Yeah, my congregation is called Church of the Savior. It's in Cedar Park.
It's
affiliated
I'm going to replace that guy that left.
I'm sorry?
I'll come and replace that guy that left.
Yeah, there you go. It's affiliated with the United Church of Christ.
Okay.
And most people would know that from Barack Obama. He attended a UCC church in Chicago.
Okay. Anyway, that was my question.
It's also affiliated with American Baptists, which are not Southern Baptists, and the split there is from the Civil War, and another smaller group, the Alliance of Baptists. But I'm going to disagree with you to a point, and the reason is because of my family members that are pretty religious fundamentalists. My parents, some of my siblings, their family. I have a nephew who writes for a very, very right-wing paper, which I think is a ridiculous paper, but he's an incredibly intelligent guy, incredibly intelligent, and it is beneath him, in my opinion, to write for this particular paper. He could be writing, like Bill Buckley for the Washington Post, if he wanted, because I think he's that intelligent, and so I look at, let me just give an example. My oldest sister and I were very close growing up, but when I came out, I happened to be one of the, two lesbian Baptist affiliated ministers in the state of Texas. The other one's also here in Austin. But there are other UCC lesbian ministers in the state. But when I came out, my family was not particularly happy being entrenched in Southern Baptist and other conservative evangelical traditions, and my oldest sister in particular. And yet we were able to have a conversation where she said to me, I know you have given this a lot of thought. I know this is not something you did impulsively, and I respect your intelligence. And I said, that's great. How about I assume that you don't approve until I hear otherwise, and in the meantime, we continue to try to share our lives together, care for our parents, and enjoy our families together. And we have done that. She and her husband, who are really very right-wing politically, have been some of the closest family members that I have. So I don't see them behaving as addicts in their lives. So I'm going to push back against it simply from my family and personal experience.
I'm talking about the larger national.
Yeah, I'm not ready to go there with you, but I do get it. I do see it.
I think
Oh, yeah.
I think addiction's a very different thing than politics. I think it is a disease. And I was a chaplain in the mental health institute. Well, I think addiction is different, than the political element. I think the manifestations I've experienced ministering to people with addictions, I think politics is different. I mean, there's insecurities, there's fear, there's anger, there's anxieties, there's a lot of different traits I think we all experience.
I thought about addiction to religion.
Yeah, that's not been my experience. So.
Yeah. We have time for one more, I think.
Hamilton Richards. I've heard it said that the worst thing that can happen to a religion is for it to become a state religion. And people point to the Church of England as an example. You want to comment on that?
The worst thing that happened to Christianity was for Constantine to say that it was a state religion. I would agree with that, because I think Christianity is at best when it is the voice for justice, for the oppressed, for the poor, for the hungry. And when you become the state religion, it's difficult to do that. My only caveat, when I went to Denmark and I talked to people there, Christianity is more or less a state religion in Denmark. They could not understand in any way, shape, or form how a quote-unquote Christian nation like the United States did not want health care for all, because from their Christian perspective, it was just the most natural thing to want to do. So they have universal health care because of their faith heritage, and we don't. I would rather have theirs. But ultimately, I think it's damaging for a religion to be the state religion.
I think it's damaging for the state as well, because I think one of the great things about America is the diversity of religion. And I think it's hard to have that diversity of religion when you have a state religion, because it's going to squash them out.
Agreed. And I think that if we rely too much on the charismatic influence of any particular leader at any particular time, which brings us back to the Johnson Amendment also, I think that we were putting our lives in uncertain hands. And I think the mechanisms of civility with diversity, the mechanisms of thoughtfulness in question asking as opposed to answer bestowing, will serve us much greater in the long run. And I would include any state religion, whether it's Christian, which is the go-to, but of course, Yasser spoke a little bit about Islamic countries that have Muslim as the state, and I would say there's a lot of dilemmas also in Israel as a so-called Jewish state, and I think that that's a very, very important conversation to say that how we lose sight of, as Mary was talking about, the prophetic vision of taking care of each other. I think it's lost very quickly as we institutionalize those mechanisms of power.
You do that, you have that marriage, and you create what we would call a scholar for a dollar, where people are no longer interested in the promotion of the ideals, but rather in the promotion of the policies of the state.
Okay, one final
There
question.
are a couple of people who have their hand up for a while, and if you can make it short, that
Well,
would be
maybe, may I
great.
make a suggestion?
Have more.
As we sometimes for Jews, because the questions go on and on. May I suggest, and you can take it, maybe everyone asks their questions and then we just respond to what has been said? Like maybe 3 questions at once? 3 people at once? And then done?
That's harder to do.
That's how we do it in Jerusalem. It is.
Because we'll have time for one-on-one after.
So it's been an interesting discussion, but what I would like to hear from each of you is whether or not the Johnson Amendment is or is not still present in law, will it change the way you decide to speak with your congregations?
It won't.
It won't change the life.
No.
For a long time.
Should the words "under God" be part of the Pledge of Allegiance?
No. Yes.
Yes? So we have a difference of opinion.
Cool.
So Tom.
No. I think it comes out of the same era, actually. It comes out of the Eisenhower administration. And I think, again, I think that we are striving to be good people, and I don't think that that's a judgment about people who, so eloquently you said, don't have, a religion as a worldview. But I do believe that it reminds us in a particular way of what we might strive to be. And I think God is a good. And I don't think, I think that it's something that we can remind ourselves about when we are searching for significance and meaning. And let me just say this, as one who is outspoken against the minute of silence and prayer as many years ago when we were discussing it, and it actually made the papers about how, I don't think importing or speaking about that is a prayer space in a public school, let's say. That's a different question. But I think preserving this idea of, as Phil was saying really beautifully, about the intentions of our framers, and I do believe that God was included in them.
I feel that under God comes to imposing religion on the state. That's why I'm against it.
Yeah, I hear you. Passionately moderation.
Good to hear your perspective.
Okay,
one more? Or? One more.
Pardon?
Can we do one more?
We do one more? Okay, this gentleman here.
And then I think we've got one.
Yeah.
My name is Ted, Lutheran by birth and current practice. A word from one of the faith traditions not represented on the panel, the Dalai Lama. A new book given to me by my wife, by our granddaughter and her husband. An Appeal to the World is the name of the book. Have any of you heard of this book? It is a 2017 book.
Yes.
You have heard of it? Would you care to comment on it? I know that you haven't heard of it. I would recommend that you expose yourself to it, and anybody else in the audience. By the Dalai Lama, it's an interview between him and Franz Alt, a TV journalist from Germany, and it's a series of about 28 statements by the interviewer and a question, and the Dalai Lama's brief response to that question. And it has to do with the development of secular ethics, morals in the community. I think it speaks to a lot of the questions that we've been discussing here in the last 15 minutes. Would you care to comment on that?
Thank you, Ted. It's good to see you. I am not familiar with that particular book from the Dalai Lama, so I don't want to say any more than that.
It's like a one-way read.
In general, I admire him, but I can't speak to that book.
One of the real problems with having a panel that is very thoughtful and articulate is that you cannot get to a lot of the questions. But we do want to leave room for people to come up and talk to individual panel members afterwards. So I want to ask you to please join me in thanking the panel members. It's been an exceptionally thoughtful, interesting discussion. Those of you who can, please help stack up some of the chairs. And anything else, Joanne?
No, we have, the first Saturday of the month, next, I think it's February 3rd. I'm not 100% sure what we're going to be talking about, but I hope it's just as stimulating as this one. It will be here. Yeah, for 2018, we will be here. The only date that we so far cannot use is May 5th because there is an election. And you'll all wonder what election, and I'm going to say it's got to be Austin Community College and AISD. So there will be 10 people. There will be 10 people who come to vote. It's a polling location. But thank you all very much for coming. Be looking for our next meeting.